Well, welcome everyone to this forum today with Professor Jeffrey Sachs on globalisation and the economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. The forum is being hosted jointly by Fairtrade Australia New Zealand, the Global Compact Network Australia, and by SDSN Australia New Zealand Pacific. And we're very pleased that you've been able to join us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, where many of us are today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also note we have people from many other parts of the world, and I particularly say tēnā koutou katoa to our friends from New Zealand, and very pleased to have people from Asia and the Americas. But all of us, of course, are facing this common challenge, this very difficult time through the COVID-19 pandemic. The health impacts of COVID-19 have been devastating, and the economic impacts are the worst we've experienced since the Great Depression. We are really at an incredibly important time in history where the decisions that we make, whether as governments or businesses or communities, will largely determine whether we're on a path to a sustainable recovery from this pandemic, or whether we lose hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives and livelihoods, and potentially go on the sort of pathway that the world saw after the Great Depression. We really do need the best minds, people with the best minds to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're very fortunate to have one of those people with us today, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Professor Sachs will be known to many of you. He was previously the director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and now he directs the Centre for Sustainable Development there. He's been a key advisor on the Sustainable Development Goals to 3 Secretary Generals of the United Nations, and he's an SDG advocate for the current Secretary General, Guterres. Jeffrey is very widely published, and he's recently written a book, which The Ages of Globalisation, which I'd certainly urge you to read. But Jeffrey Sachs is, while a very strong academic and writer, he's also been at the coalface, advising governments around the world about difficult economic decisions as we face today. And another example in history where Jeffrey played a key role was with the government of Poland, where he advised the government there on the transition to an open economy at the time of the fall of the Iron Curtain and the change of Poland towards a democratic open nation. So we're very fortunate to have Jeffrey talk to us today. I'll finally mention that Jeffrey Sachs has been appointed the chair of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission, which will be advising governments and the UN about the sort of responses we need to be taking to the pandemic. So just before Jeffrey starts, I do welcome all of you again. I urge you, if you do have questions, there will be some time for questions after Jeffrey has spoken. So put them in the Q&A, put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll see whether we're able to get to as many of them as possible. So now, Jeffrey, over to you. Thank you very much, Jeffrey Sachs.
John, thank you. Thanks to all of you for having this conversation today. And I want to thank Fairtrade Australia and the UN Global Compact and my colleagues at SDSN. John Thwaites is a wonderful leader of SDSN, the chair of the board of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and also chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, one of our absolute leaders in this global network. the idea of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network is to try to bring knowledge, expertise, and training to the challenges of sustainable development. And this is a hard task in general because some governments around the world, including my own, are rather resistant to information and to science. So we face many headwinds, but I don't think we have really faced headwinds like the ones that we are facing now with COVID-19. As John kindly mentioned, I've been engaged in economic change for 40 years now, both as an academic and as a policy advisor in all parts of the world. It is easy to say with the absolute full certainty, we've never faced anything like we're facing now, not in our professional lifetimes. We are facing conditions like the Great Depression. We're facing a pandemic like the great pandemic of 100 years ago, which we knew about from the history books and from the stories that were told. But this is ours, and we're in the midst of it. It's very dramatic. I think it can probably help guide our conversation to talk about this new COVID-19 commission of the Lancet being one of the world's leading public health and medical journals, which has an illustrious tradition that I'm delighted that I'm part of, and that John, as a commissioner in this new commission, is a part of hosting commissions to look at major thematic challenges, whether it's the challenges of environmental health, on which there's been a wonderful commission, or the challenges of fighting AIDS. And now we have a commission, a Lancet COVID-19 commission. And when I was asked, and I was really honored and delighted to accept this opportunity to contribute, we thought about what are the major challenges that we face in this pandemic. And I would say that there are 4 of them that I would like to set out so that we can discuss them in an orderly and organized way. The first challenge, of course, is suppressing the pandemic itself. We have this new and deadly disease. Turns out that it causes deaths in somewhere around 0.5% of all infections. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of context that matters, and it is a parameter, this infection fatality rate, that depends on the age and the circumstances of each individual that's infected. But that's a very deadly disease, much worse, we understand, than a bad flu season, that's for sure. But we're also learning, as everybody knows, that this is not just a killer, but it's also a disabler, that it leads to chronic conditions and complicated ones that are still not understood and unraveled: neurological, cardiovascular, pulmonary, and other conditions that persist for months and perhaps indefinitely. Because it is a new pathogen, it is expected that most of us are vulnerable to it, and that is still the prevailing hypothesis of the epidemiologists. And the logic of that is that if this were just to run unabated until we were to reach very high proportions of the world population infected, now estimated to be somewhere between 40 and 60%, so-called herd immunity thresholds, this will continue to unfold. And if you think about what 40% of the world infected would mean, that would mean 3 billion cases. Right now we have 22 million confirmed cases, perhaps 10 times that, taking into account cases that were asymptomatic or simply not tested for some reasons. So we're very, very far from anything like herd immunity, meaning anything like a level of infection that would by itself presumably stop the epidemic from going forward, because enough of the world population would have been infected and hopefully protected by virtue of that infection. Well, we don't want to reach herd immunity because that would mean vast, vast numbers of lives lost. Again, we have basically 8 billion people on the planet. So 1% of the world population is 80 million people. A half of that, 40 million, would be the deaths at an IFR, an infection fatality rate of 0.5%. Horrific. So the first goal for all of us is to suppress the pandemic. There are two ways to do this: the so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions. The reason why Victoria State got locked down again after a reoccurrence of infection is that these NPIs, these non-pharmaceutical interventions, mean keeping infectious people away from others. Ideally, that's done through testing, tracing, early quarantining, physical distancing, face mask wearing, and so on. And in the non-ideal circumstances, it's done through lockdowns, because what we should do at lower cost doesn't get done. We have somewhat unruly societies. They like to congregate. We're human beings. People like to party. People forget, especially when infection rates go down. They start again dropping the face masks, getting together in dangerous ways. The United States is one of the most unruly of all places, because we have a crazy president who can't give an honest statement, but also because people don't want to behave. So we just had a major gathering of motorcyclists, which brought together hundreds of thousands of people, and now they're counting how many cases are spreading across the country because of this absolutely extraordinarily unacceptable gathering that just occurred. Okay, the other kind of suppression of the pandemic is a vaccine. I'll say more about that later, but as you know, there are about 200 vaccine candidates in trial right now, and something's going to work in part. So this is going to be good news with huge complications that we should consider, in that who's going to get the vaccines, how effective will they be, what are potential risks and side effects, so what's going to be fair. These are all problems that are not being properly addressed because politicians don't do things in a systematic way, by and large, especially in my country. So we're going to face major challenges there. Well, the second pillar of the Lancet Commission, after the question of suppressing the epidemic itself, is facing the humanitarian crises everywhere. I'm sure it's true to some extent in Australia, but it's really true in the United States, which is a rich country managed in a god-awful way, but a rich country. We've got a hunger crisis in the US, of all things. A recent Census Bureau survey found that 16% of American households with children did not have enough food to put on the table in a recent week, the week of the survey. This is shocking because this is one of the richest places in the world. It's also one of the most unequal places in the world. It is also with a political system that is one of the most uncaring that I know of in the world. That's saying a lot because I work all over the world. So we have a hunger crisis here, but imagine the hunger crisis in a low-income country in Africa right now, where remittance income has plummeted, where tourist income has plummeted, perhaps where the terms of trade has deteriorated seriously if the country is an oil exporter, for example. These are places that are food importing countries that have experienced a shocking drop of incomes for places where a significant part of the population lives right on the edge. And normally you would say, well, governments need to do something, but all of those shocks that I just mentioned, whether it's the declining remittance income, whether it's the loss of terms of trade, whether it's the loss of tourist income and so forth, all of that hits directly government budgets as well. So we're seeing massive needs for humanitarian relief at the same time that we're seeing plummeting government revenues. Well, if you're a rich country like the United States and Australia, governments can borrow and central banks can print money. The Fed essentially has issued more than $3 trillion of credit, by some measures, more than $5 trillion of credit during this crisis. That's why the stock market is soaring at the same time that the real economy is plummeting, because there's so much liquidity in the system. But try that if you're a poor country, anything remotely like that amount of money printing and your currency will plummet. Your enterprises that have dollar-denominated debts will fall into extreme crisis. And so we are seeing a humanitarian crisis in addition to a fiscal crisis in much of the developing world. So that's the second main pillar of the COVID Commission. The third pillar is the longer-term cleanup of the debt. Governments, where they can borrow, are borrowing. And as I mentioned, the United States federal government has a deficit this year, probably 15 to 20% of GDP. It's not over yet, so I can't give you a definitive number, but it's on the order of about 3.7 trillion and still counting that are COVID-related emergency outlays combined with the sharp decline of government revenues. Again, developing countries can't really do that, but they are borrowing and they will have unpayable debts at the end of this. So there will be a shadow from this crisis, even if there is some fairly quick suppression of the pandemic itself. The final pillar is the building back better. We will be in depression conditions worldwide. We are right now. Output is down 5 to 10% this year compared to last year. Unemployment has soared. Working hours are down 20 or 25% in the OECD countries. It's really amazing. And we don't have up-to-date numbers for most of the world, but nobody's really escaping this, with the partial exception of China, where the pandemic originated, but China was very resolute and very effective in suppressing the pandemic, actually teaching all the rest of us that it was possible to do that. And so China actually is going to have year-over-year growth, rather amazing. But all the rest of us are basically going to see year-over-year declines that are quite significant. We're going to need a coordinated strategy of recovery. It's going to be from a crisis deeper than 2008. And how to do this in a sensible and sustainable manner is a huge question. So that's the agenda. And I'm happy to speak in detail about any aspects of that. I'll say that what makes all of this hard is our global politics, starting with the United States. The Trump administration is an enemy of rationality. Trump himself is a mentally unstable person, and his government is an extreme nationalist government. It's running re-election on a white racist platform. And I am not partisan, believe it or not. I'm just speaking to help you understand our situation in the United States. And it's not for titillation or excitement that I say these things. It is because there's a kind of normalization of Trump in other parts of the world. And there should not be a normalization of this man. I'm now 65 years old. My first president was Dwight Eisenhower. I have seen a lot of presidents in the United States. We have never had the dangers that we have right now. And this guy might stay in power. And by any means, it's really dangerous. If he does, I have to be frank with you, I don't think we're getting out of this in a sane and rational way, because this is really dangerous. The odds are that he's not going to win. That's what I'm counting on. But if he does, this is not normal. And while Australia is a close ally of the United States, you should understand this is not normal. What's also not normal, and I have to tell you, is Rupert Murdoch's propaganda empire, which is the base, the core of Trump's method here. Because Fox News in the United States is absolutely incorrigible, and it is dangerous, and it is repulsive. So that is the biggest problem. We just can't have a rational discussion about these issues in the United States. We have more people now out on the streets because there have been more police shootings. We have, as I mentioned, large gatherings of motorbike fans, hundreds of thousands getting together in the middle of a pandemic. We have a huge argument about whether face masks are some left-wing idea because they're a denial of freedom, according to our right wing in this country. We've got really a colossal mess. And it's for this reason that the United States, under Trump, pulled out of the WHO at the height of a global pandemic. And I think of relevance for all of us, the political game plan, partly tactical and partly truly delusional, but both a combination of tactics, I can't call it strategic, but I would call it delusional, is to incite a new Cold War on China. And Australia is supposed to be a big partner in this. It is a god-awful idea, very dangerous, again, filled with the American evangelical zeal of Mr. Pompeo, filled with lies, and very, very dangerous, but a huge obstacle to global cooperation and global recovery if we get that chance. So I have to say, as I see this, a lot depends on the US election, a lot. And I can see the way forward if Biden wins. If Trump wins, we're really going to be scrambling, but it will not be normal, and it will not be safe, and it will not be on a path of resolution. So that's one point. A second point is about the vaccines. Something is probably going to work in part, and it's very unlikely that something works definitively. And what that means is that in 2021, probably there will be immunizations, and they probably will give some protection, and they probably will reduce deaths, and they probably will help slow the pandemic, and that's all wonderful. And they probably will not end the need for the non-pharmaceutical interventions. They probably will not lift the barriers to return to what we regard as normal life in the past. It's most likely that vaccines, the early ones, will not have that degree of efficacy. And it's also likely that the actual rollout of immunizations will take years, not months. So this is just something to note, that we're probably in this for at least another year to two of difficulties of going about our normal lives. A third point I would mention is we will not go back to normal, pre-COVID normal, almost under any circumstances, because we have plunged into a new kind of economy. We've really accelerated, probably by 10 years at least, the move to the digital economy. Offices in every part of the world have discovered, hey, we can do this from home. Commerce has shifted to online. Medicine has shifted to telemedicine. Education has shifted partly online. Nobody wants to live in an all Zoom world, that's for sure. But on the other hand, we won't revert back to the old ways either. And so this means that there's going to be a lot of dislocation. There will not be anything like a V-shaped recovery in many sectors, because we won't go back to what we were doing beforehand. And that behooves us to think about what kind of economy we do want to develop in the future. One thing for sure is we need universal access to digital services, because the digital world is our new reality, and kids that don't have a screen to be able to participate with their schoolmates, or people that don't have access to the internet and so forth, cannot participate properly in society now. So this will become a major theme. So too will the question of how to get out of chronically high unemployment. And there, I think the main point that I want to end on is that when we build back, let's listen to science and evidence this time, not to propaganda. For a long time, the scientists told us another pandemic is on its way. Indeed, you go back and you can find all the articles, not just about the likelihood of a pandemic, but the likelihood of a coronavirus pandemic, because the experts were already saying that just like SARS, there's going to be another zoonotic event of a virus passing from bats to human beings in China at some point in the not distant future, because such events happen actually with frequency, though they don't make pandemics with the frequency. But our politicians don't listen. They're not very clever, in my experience. They're not scientifically trained. They view scientists as pests who can hinder their re-elections. In the United States, it is a game to bash science. And one of the interesting things is that I spoke with a senator in the United States bemoaning the absence of a scientific response to COVID. And he said, Jeff, you don't understand. This anti-science that we're seeing has been the fossil fuel industry's MO, modus operandi, for decades in Congress. They have done everything to create an anti-scientific environment for years because they want the free play to continue on the dangerous climate path. I think that this is right, that what we're experiencing with COVID is the same thing that we have had with climate change, which is the resistance to change by the same politicians for basically the same reasons. They don't want to listen to scientific evidence which is inconvenient for their financial backers or inconvenient for the status quo. And it's not a coincidence that Trump is both utterly irresponsible on COVID, so that we have 175,000 deaths and counting, but also completely reckless on climate change. And the same is true with many leaders around the world. They've gone together. So when we build back, we should understand we have to build back clean and environmentally safe. And thanks to fair trade licensees, because that's your core goal. This is extremely important. We need to build back in a climate safe way and in an ecologically safe way. The zoonotic diseases are a reflection of the great pressures that human activity is putting on animal ecosystems, which raise the contacts with animal pathogen reservoirs like the bat population in Southwest China. So this time, I don't want to leave it to the politicians. They don't know what they're doing. We need to get expertise. We need to get the knowledge. That's the goal of SDSN. It is the mission of our universities around the world, our knowledge centers, and I think our most important objective is that going out of this crisis and aiming for rebuilding, we do it in a serious way with principled companies and with the best of our knowledge. So it's a big challenge. I'm not holding my breath till November, but that's a key date for history, our election. Thanks very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I think I'm going to be brought onto video shortly, but there we go. Thanks very much, Jeff. Well, you've certainly set us some challenges there and left us in no doubt as to your views.
Yes,
which is great. This event today is being co-hosted by Fairtrade Australia, by the Global Compact and SDSN. And we're very fortunate to have the leaders of those organisations here today. And I'd like to start this part of the session by asking Molly Harris-Olsen, who is the CEO of Fairtrade Australia, previously actually worked in the Clinton White House, but she is playing a lead role in fair trade around Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific, but was previously the chair globally of fair trade. So Molly, can I ask you to respond to Jeff's inspiring words today?
Sure. Thank you so much, John. And really, it's been a pleasure working with both you and Kylie to try to bring this together. But we're very, very honored indeed, Professor Sachs, to have you here and to be able to explore these extremely difficult challenges that the world is facing with someone who's been involved for so long, such as yourself, and with such tremendous impact. You mentioned the health recovery and the priority of that, the desperate humanitarian crisis that this has exacerbated and threatens to erode 30 years of the great progress that you have pushed so hard on. 580 million people have been estimated to already be on the verge of being pushed right back into poverty that is devastating. And then you mentioned Build It Back Better, which I guess we have been very focused on trying to figure out how to make sure that that $9 trillion US that is being thrown around for stimulus packages around the world actually goes into constructive purposes and is used as it was in South Korea after the global financial crisis to such great effect to achieve its climate sustainability and digital transformation goals. It's really it is really disheartening to think about the state of the world. And I know someone quoted Obama apparently said recently that that he wished he could take from Australia our gun control, our healthcare, and our compulsory voting. And I think with those three things, we could indeed improve the state of the world and potentially the state of the elections forthcoming in the United States, which really are enough to stop all of our hearts from beating properly. But I guess I'm old enough to have been influenced in my economic studies as a very young student by the work of Susan George all those years ago about the fate worse than dead and how the other half dies. And when I think about where we are in the world today, it feels like, and it must be even more accentuated for you, that we're going one step forward, three steps back. And in fair trade, I really, it's interesting because I had 20 years of work on biodiversity protection and coral reefs and environmental leading campaigns on the Rainbow Warrior before the White House. And I really have been committed to these issues all my life. But when I got onto the Global Board of Fair Trade, what really struck me was that it had designed this alternative trading structure that is now got over $12 billion a year in retail sales. So it's the only globally scaled alternative system that is actually alleviating poverty and inclusive in its focus on the equality issues that the world faces. It's been going for over 30 years, and it really is this amazing structure. And what struck me was, if we're going to stop going one step forward, three steps back, we have to figure out a way to change the structural underpinnings of some of these fundamental ways in which we violate, you know, basic equality. And the Sustainable Development Goals, and Kylie, I know we'll be talking more about those, you know, are a profound framework for the world to use. But I suppose I want to just flag that fair trade as a global system is standing ready to really support. You mentioned this morning on Fran Kelly, the IMF, and kind of investing in countries to be able to respond to the health crisis. We would love to see the WTO, whose least developed countries are the ones most impacted by these unfair structures that underpin just this exacerbation of inequality, to really adopt a framework consistent with the structures, again, that underpin how we address having more fairness in the world's trading systems. So I guess I would just say that the work that you're doing is profoundly important. Fairtrade has, of course, like so many organizations, looked at the Sustainable Development Goals as a vehicle for coming out of this humanitarian and health crisis in a way that gives our next generations even a little bit of hope. To imagine that there's a world where they might have a good job that's meaningful, where they might be able to contribute to a healthy planet that still has a little bit of biodiversity on it. And I really want to thank you for all the tremendous work you do, and also really acknowledge the amazing companies that already are investing so much more in their supply chains in the fair trade world. We have thousands of companies, and in the region here, we've tried to invite as many of our licensees as we can, because they're the ones that actually have taken these steps to take personal responsibility for their companies, to invest in their supply chains in a transparent way, and to actually have that more inclusive growth opportunity. It has never been more important than right now as we are sinking into these other crises to think about these structures. And I just invite you to work with us in Fairtrade, and the Fairtrade Global structures are very keen to support the work you're doing in any way we can. And I want to just again thank you, and again thank my co-hosts, Professor Thwaites, who also sits on the board of Fairtrade, thankfully, and Kylie with the UN Global Compact for creating this opportunity for a conversation. So I look forward to passing it over to both my colleagues and our participants. Thank you so much, Jeffrey.
Thanks very much, Molly. Jeff, would you like to just make a very quick comment in relation to the role of fair trade in this recovery?
I would. What does a good recovery mean? ecologically, it means two things. One is moving to a safe, renewable energy-based system for our transport, electrification, and so forth. So we need to decarbonize the energy system. And it means sustainable land use. It means that agriculture and the supply chains for all of our global land use needs to be sustainable. And many of the companies in fair trade are the world leaders in sustainability of land use and protecting ecosystems that are under threat. It seems to me just very quickly that a few things can be tremendously helpful, and I want to jump at Molly's invitation for partnership on this, because I think that there are tremendous things that we can do. One is to note that I believe that Germany will be passing actually a global supply chain legislation soon. This is very exciting. The first time saying that German companies will need to have responsibility not just for their own activities, but for their supply chains. This legal framework on global supply chains, I think, is one part of what we should do, and engaging WTO in this is also very important and promising. Second is reorienting our companies. Of course, we have ESG investing, and we have the Business Roundtable in the United States announcing a multi-stakeholder approach. But the truth is that at least in the US context, our companies are shareholder bottom line companies. And that's not good for the world, and it's not good for business. It's not actually even good for business. So one of my favorite companies in the world is Unilever, one of the major leaders of fair trade, and Paul Pullman, one of the world's great business people. And he showed that you can manage responsibly, and he fought back against one of these ruthless bottom line companies, Kraft Heinz, which went into a tailspin because it's run by hedge funds, not by people who like their customers. It's not oriented towards environmental sustainability. So we need companies with purpose. And I do think that this actually is going to need legal reform also to change our company laws in the United States, because they are too shareholder dominated and they are too irresponsible. The third thing that we need is pathways of sustainable land use. This is quite complicated because land is used for many competing purposes. One is for nature itself, leave it alone, thank you. Another is for agricultural production. A third is for carbon storage. A fourth is for siting infrastructure or siting renewable energy and so on. And we don't have good policy control or sense on what are sustainable pathways of land use. And for that reason, the Amazon is on fire again. The Indonesian, Malaysian archipelago is massively deforested. China has an insatiable demand for tropical hardwoods and other products. The Congo Basin is under threat. And I think that we need the integration of the science and the businesses urgently, and the mapping, so that we know what we're doing and we know what we're talking about, and we are watching in real time the deforestation and saying, no, we just cannot have this continue. We have to say to President Bolsonaro, no, Brazil cannot trade effectively in the international system while you turn your back to the Amazon. It's not going to happen. It's not going to work. So I think we need pathways like, John, we have done on decarbonization together. We need that kind of pathway analysis for land use. And in SDSN, we have a project which we call FABLE, food, agriculture, biodiversity, land use, and energy, to say, oh my God, 5 complicated things that are all interconnected. how do we make all of those goals work? Healthy food supply, carbon storage, citing renewable energy, building economies, ensuring that ecosystems function. And I think there's just a lot of analytical work that needs to be done in addition to the great leadership of fair trade, public benefit corporations, legal requirements on supply chains, and a revised WTO. So it's a big agenda.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for raising land use, which of course is critical to many of the people on this call. And that FABLE project, food, agriculture, biodiversity, land use and energy, highlights that these issues are connected. And I think, as you know, we, through ClimateWorks Australia, are leading a project in Australia to do just that, to bring those together and working with farmers, federations, companies to do it.
Fantastic. So important.
And we're working, I see on the chat also Gary Nairn from the Malone Institute has made a comment that this is also about regenerative agriculture. So it's actually putting back, it's not just not taking away, it's putting back into the nature, and there's huge opportunities there. So thanks, Gary. You also raised the issue of companies with a purpose, and that's a really good introduction to Kylie Porter, who's the CEO of the Global Compact Network Australia, and is working with leading companies around Australia who are seeking to do more than just the bottom line. Interestingly, Kylie recently coordinated a number of those companies to make a submission around how we can build back better to the Australian government. And she's bringing companies together to really change the way they're operating. So Kylie, it's great to have you today. And do you have any responses you'd like to make to Jeff's address today?
Thanks, John. And also thanks, Molly and John, for pulling this together. And Jeffrey, this is
You're not.
Me. Great. Sorry about that. There's always going to be technical issues somewhere along the line, isn't there? Jeffrey, it's been an absolute pleasure listening to you today. I've been a huge fan for quite some time. You know, your No Poverty book influenced me highly when I was doing my master's degree, so thank you for that. You made some really interesting comments today, and I think the building back better and some of the challenges that we're going to face getting to that point was the one that resonated with me the most. And I think it's really important that people understand that those depression conditions, because of, you know, and the liquidity issues that we're going to experience, to me that really resonated because it shows that we should be investing a lot more into green growth and into infrastructure and into other areas of our economy that really do allow us to build back better. I think, you know, what you're saying about China and the potential for the Cold War and the fact that that's going to be really dangerous and also a potential obstacle for global cooperation is really scary. And I think there are a lot of challenges with China. I know that this has happened in the US too, but there's obviously a lot of questions around some of their ways of operating. So, for example, the forced labour allegations. And so the question is, how do we overcome all of this to ensure that globalisation is done or continues to be done in a way that improves equity and we don't end up in the same position that we have been? I also think, and it goes to what you and Molly started to talk around about the notion of the end of shareholder primacy and the reinvigoration or the reinventing of companies. And it's really great to hear what Germany's doing. I mean, they led the way. They're the prime example of the transition away from coal-fired energy. And they're obviously now leading the way in terms of supply chain accountability. But what I really think the big thing is that this whole COVID crisis should be giving business and government the opportunity to build back better and transition our economies. And you know, this universal access to digital services that you talked about and the focus on scientific evidence are really crucial to that, as well as really spurring on business ambition. And that business ambition needs to just go beyond their own businesses. It needs to be used to talk to states and states from a federal level, but also from that state level. And here in Australia, we do see the states often leading the way and the federal government lagging behind. But at some point, the federal government will have to catch up. And hence why our letter that John mentioned around the road to recovery, why we sent that to the Prime Minister now about really using the SDGs as that framework for the recovery, because the work that yourself and an awful lot of other very skilled people put together when they developed the SDGs, that is a framework for recovery, and it is a framework for future growth that will be sustainable and inclusive. So I think part of the challenge that we've got going forward, and I know that this is something that the Global Compact Network Australia here is really passionate about, is how do we bring business along the way with that, right? How do we overcome any changes that could be blockers to that resilience? We don't want to go back to normal. I think I'm finding it quite amusing that a lot of people now are saying, oh, you know, when are we going to get back to normal? But normal didn't work. Like it didn't work for many developing countries. It absolutely didn't work for underdeveloped countries. It hasn't worked. You only have to look at the impacts of climate change. You only have to look at the impacts that are happening more broadly on the huge growth in inequities globally to know that it didn't work. So let's take this opportunity while we're, you know, in depression conditions, when we're struggling with liquidity, to really think about how we can build back better and what that road to recovery is, so that, you know, for want of a much, you know, overused term, so that we can live in the new normal. So, you know, thank you very much for your talk today. I don't want to take up more time because I know that we've got lots of people who would like to ask questions, but it has been an absolute honour. And I am reading your book at the moment, so I echo John's view that everyone should read it. It's a very, very, very interesting concept. So thank you again, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Kylie. And it's worth highlighting that today's event has been jointly organised by Global Compact, a business organisation, Fairtrade, which is a business and consumer and producer organisation, and that's a really important point, that it is poor farmers who are at the heart of fair trade, and SDSN, representing universities and knowledge institutions in Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific. And what is heartening is that these groups have come together, not just today, but we've been working on this for the last 4 or 5 years on trying to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have a great collaboration, not only within country, but across countries and into Asia as well. And these organisations, I think, are potentially an example for the sort of global collaboration we're going to need in the recovery. I do want to emphasise we've got lots of listeners today from New Zealand. And Jeff, it is worth highlighting how comparatively well New Zealand has managed the COVID pandemic. There's somewhat of an outbreak at the moment, but really, if you look at on a world basis, New Zealand has done an extraordinary job in managing the pandemic, but also I think in focusing on the well-being of their citizens as well. So I'm really pleased. I've looked at the questions, and the first question we've got is from New Zealand, and it's from Josie Pagani, who's the Executive Director of the Council for International Development in New Zealand, which represents all the development agencies from New Zealand. So, Josie, are you able to ask your question?
Yes, I'm just unmuting myself. Thank you, John. And Jeff, it's fantastic to hear from you again. I actually did some work with you at the OECD DAC when I was there a long time ago. But I have a quick question. And you mentioned very clearly, you outlined these two really difficult challenges, that government revenues have plummeted and yet the need is devastating, so it's increasing. And we have this political challenge of an increased isolationism, protectionism, sort of anti-globalisation on the left and the right. But there is also a healthy kind of hyper-localisation where we've all kind of gone, we like our local community and we look after each other. And if I look at development in the Pacific, there's an increase, which is fantastic, an accelerated, locally owned development practice going on because the borders have been closed. So my question is really, how do we retell the story of aid to increase support for aid, which is declining, and that's a long-term trend. How can we use this opportunity of a sort of reformed globalisation and a kind of healthy hyper-localisation, and putting my fair trade hat on too, what's the story we're telling licensees about the need for fair trade? And what is the story we're telling the public about aid in this COVID environment?
John, may I?
Yep.
Yeah,
Go,
good.
Jeffrey, yep.
Well, Josie, thank you very much and great to see you again. I think the epidemic shows we're interconnected whether we want it or not. And believe me, there is no decent life ahead if this is raging in any part of the world. So even the most basic point that we ought to be helping every part of the world to suppress this pandemic so that we actually can open up our borders again and open up our lives again is very real. I don't think New Zealand, which has done a wonderful job, wants to stay completely closed. I would doubt that. And I would think that what New Zealand would like is a world without COVID that has the same proficiency and success that New Zealand has had in suppressing the pandemic. And I really admire Prime Minister Ardern and all that she's accomplished and done, by the way, with so much transparency and humanity attached. It's also really inspiring, which is a little far cry from what we're living through right now. So I think the first point is that it is normal in an interconnected world that we help each other because that is how the world can stay safe, peaceful, not having diseases coming at us from all corners, not having disasters coming at us from all corners. What's ironic about all of the aid issues that I've been engaged in for more than 30 years is that what's really required to help the poor in the world is something like a percentage point of income of the rich world. And we have so aggressively begrudged that year in, year out at the result of millions of lives squandered, hundreds of millions of kids without an education, diseases that aren't controlled. And we think this is somehow good savings or lack of, this is a good way to save our money. And Trump's first instinct is to cut more aid. You know what the US gives in aid right now? 0.16 of 1% of our income for aid. And our military budget is 30 times that. So we're spending 30 times on the military what we're spending in development aid. And did we get a safe United States? No. We have more people dying of this disease coming from outside than all the wars we've been involved in. In other words, what are we doing? Not thinking through the most basic things that we need for decency, not only because they're decent, but they're decent because they're the minimum rational things to do, that people shouldn't be dying, shouldn't be suffering from hunger, shouldn't be vulnerable to out of control epidemic diseases, shouldn't be unvaccinated, and on and on. Again, unfortunately, our politicians are really difficult in this. Their job, they think, is campaigning to local people in sound bites. We don't even have sound bites anymore. It's a tweet, we live on tweets, which is really the stupidest way to live imaginable, that we think we can express something meaningful in 140 characters, or Trump's tweets something stupid and then Pelosi tweets something stupid in return. I shudder at our country that this is how we're having politics now. It's mind-boggling that we can't have a decent discussion on this. So the truth is, we should look at what the cost of doing certain things are and saying, oh my God, that's the best conceivable bargain in the world, that this could give us some decency. Now, institutionally, I'm a little bit in despair that our politicians can do this. Frankly, even when President Obama was in office and I pitched development aid, he wasn't interested. Not that he wasn't interested. He said, find me the votes. I couldn't find him the votes. He's the president. I'm the academic. But you know, he just felt, oh, politically, I can't manage that. I'm not so sure that decency is impossible to sell, by the way. And we're maybe so exhausted with indecency in the United States that if a politician actually speaks decently, maybe the public would, in shock, you know, say, yeah, we'd like to be decent too. So I believe that this stuff is sellable to the public. But I also think that we should make our international organizations fit for purpose. And I mentioned the IMF. The IMF should be the lender of last resort, and it should be essentially like the central bank for the world, and especially for countries that don't have central banks, or don't have central banks of stable currencies, to really help these countries in extremis. And we have a fantastic managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, who's absolutely just stupendously terrific. And we ought to be giving her the support, but also the arguments to the board for the finance minister of Australia, the finance minister of New Zealand, the finance ministers of other countries that are participating in our discussion. Go to the IMF board and really use this marvelous instrument for the emergency financing that we really need.
Thanks, Jeff, for that. We've got a question here from Audette Excel, the founder and chair of the Adara Group. And the Adara Group are a company that do care about the developing world. So, Audette?
Yes, hi there. Great question, Josie. You're right in the wheelhouse of where my heart is. And I think Professor Sachs gave a brilliant answer to that. And one of the things, obviously, we're deeply concerned about, those of us that work in the developing world, is the rise of this, what I'd call parochial localization. But maybe I can take the conversation in a different direction, as you've covered that. We all know what the impacts are of kids out of school, particularly in low middle income countries, and particularly girls, and the devastating impact the longer girls are out of school. And I think that really extends to kids worldwide. So my question for you, Professor Sachs, is what do we do in our role as business leaders, as community leaders, as leaders in our families, to ensure that the current generation of young people doesn't become a lost generation through this?
Great, Odette, thank you very much. Let me make one preliminary point. Even before COVID, it was estimated that there were 260 million school-age kids out of school. 260 million. And what that was were kids in poor countries, kids in conflict zones, kids where the public budget only supported education through 8 years, for example. Not for upper secondary school, not enough, in other words, even to get the basic skills for a 21st century economy. So even before COVID, there was a profound crisis of education that was always shocking to me, because I know how hard it is to get financing for anything internationally, but health somehow in those days, a year ago, was able to generate some international financing, but education, very, very little. And I would start by SDG 4, which says universal quality education from pre-K through upper secondary for every child in the world. And UNESCO and UNICEF are basically the leaders of that. And they've said there's a budget gap, that cannot be met by the poor countries on their own, it's probably about $40 billion a year, which may sound like a lot of money. Maybe it doesn't anymore, but $40 billion a year is less than 1/10 of 1% of the rich world income. So we should be in any way financing poor countries to help get their kids in school. I mean, God, another no-brainer. This is absolutely without question. Now we face an even greater challenge, of course, probably more than 1 billion kids that are facing school closures, inconsistent school years, and so on. I think that there are several things to say about this really difficult problem. One is you really can't open the schools if the epidemic is just not in control. So the first thing is we need to get the transmission of the virus down to New Zealand-like levels or Australia-like levels, which are roughly 100th of what's going on in the high transmission countries. We need that in order to open the schools. But thanks God to Australia, New Zealand, and China, and Taiwan, and Vietnam to say, yeah, it can actually be done. I can't, get the US Congress to look at this, and certainly Trump is trying to do everything to make sure we never look at a fact again. But the basic point is you want to open schools, get transmission rates down, then schools become safe again. Even when that moment arrives, we're going to have to take precautions. And there's a lot of good advice about how to make buildings safe, ventilation, distancing, and so forth that we ought to take very seriously. So we want the kids in the physical schools. It's good for them. It's their lives. It's socialization. It's especially for young kids, especially for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. Very important that this happen. Get the pandemic down, make the school physical presence safer. And in the interim and even for the longer term, accept that there will be some online education, either the only way to go until the prevalence and incidence is down a bit. But even after that, it's good tools, actually. I like teaching in part online because you can do all sorts of things that you can't otherwise do. But then we need universal access to basic, to connectivity, first of all, to devices, and to curriculum, and training for teachers of how to use these media effectively. I actually find it quite exciting. I can give a college course and have anyone anywhere in the world just tune in, and thousands do. And that's and for free, and it's wonderful. I really like that approach. So I'd like us to use digital in a positive way, not only in a rescue way, but for that there's half the population that doesn't have access, and we need the telecoms companies, the big tech companies, the device makers to say, look, we're in this too. We're going to provide solutions for this to make sure that there's access everywhere for that online component of schooling.
And Jeff, you've highlighted the online aspect of schooling. Of course, it's worth highlighting also the online aspect of universities. And universities in Australia, New Zealand, but indeed around the world have been pretty amazing in the way they've pivoted in the space of a month or so towards largely online delivery of courses. I did have a question in the chat from Amy Malcolm about whether it's responsible for universities to be having students together in large lecture theatres. And I can say that in Australia, universities are following the advice of the chief health officers. Students aren't attending large lecture theatres in Victoria at present. And in other states, my understanding is they're following the advice from the health officers about at least 4 metre squares around every student. She did also ask about wearing masks, and I do think that's something that the rest of Australia will have to get used to. We're getting used to it here in Victoria, but I think the rest of Australia will need to, and potentially New Zealand as well in the future. I've got another question here from Pat McCafferty, who's the CEO of Yarra Valley Water and has been one of the pioneers in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals in their business models. So Pat, are you there?
I'm here, John. Thanks for that. And thanks very much, Jeff, for a very compelling discussion so far. The question I had is around, I guess it's fair to say that the pandemic has shone a further light or heightened awareness on the issues of growing vulnerability in communities. And I'm just wondering, and we're already seeing the welfare sector, they've probably never been busier and having more access to decision makers as well. My question is around, how do you see that leading to a more positive difference in the future, a more sustainable positive difference for those communities, and how optimistic are you about that?
Great. So, you know, the irony is, of course, right now, it's a drama, and it's a very serious drama. But if we choose to make inclusive societies of high well-being, we have so many wonderful ways to do this now that we should not be pessimistic at all. You know, we're in the midst of the most incredible advances of science and technology in human history. And they're coming at a rate that really is absolutely astounding. And when I talked about the vaccines, you know, while it's likely that it's going to take some time to get just what we want, I think it's also likely we're going to get something at a rate that is absolutely unprecedented, because the platforms scientifically for doing this have advanced just in the most recent years, that this vaccine development can proceed really at rates that were never before seen. So I'm a technology optimist and a technophile. I believe in this stuff, but I believe that it has to be mobilized by the desire for good, and that we need the ethics of all of this to organize our societies for the common good. And I think that that's what's happening increasingly, and I think it is in Australia and New Zealand a good thing to see what's happening. We're not there in the United States right now. We're more divided for the moment, more heated, people out on the streets in protest, people getting shot. It's really amazing. But it should be understood that in the US, we've been on this rampant, vulgar individualism for a long time. This libertarian idea, this idea that Ayn Rand is a philosopher. She was not a philosopher. She wrote lousy novels, but people have taken her seriously. And our politics got incredibly corrupt in the United States also. These are $6 or $8 billion election cycles right now. You know what that means. There's a list you can look up, the 30 billionaires financing Trump's campaign right now. Come on. And by the way, not the most generous billionaires I know. This is really a big problem. It doesn't mean we can't have decent societies. By the way, maybe one shortcut for everything is women prime ministers everywhere. I think that this would accelerate the process dramatically. And we see it, by the way, absolutely statistically, rigorously speaking, where women are leading, the situation is much better. And that's true with the Chancellor Merkel. It's true with the prime ministers of Finland, Iceland, Denmark, with New Zealand's wonderful prime minister. There's something real to that. That's not a joke. There's something strange about the male side of this species that really needs a good examination. So maybe aside from all the other institutional reforms, if we could just let women run things for a while, we'd solve the problems faster.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, there's a challenge. You talked before about Unilever, and of course, one company that great product and a great company associated with them is Ben & Jerry's. And so I would like to ask Callie Swake, who's head of Asia and new markets for Ben & Jerry's, I think has a question.
I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, you can hear me, and my video's coming through. There we go. A few technical difficulties. Thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been a fantastic chat. I know we're running out of time, so I'll get straight to my question, which is around the theme of building back better, particularly from manufacturers' point of view. As you know, Ben & Jerry's has long sought a fair and transparent supply chain. We've been working with Fairtrade now more than 15 years, sourcing ingredients, mostly for our manufacturing sites, which are based in America and Europe. I'd love to hear your view on how we could expand that model here in this region, unlocking local supply solutions for producers that meet the fair trade standards and are able to therefore help improve trade and poverty alleviation in the region.
Thanks, Callie. And I go back a long way with Ben & Jerry's ice cream, I can tell you. Yes. I was eating it 40 years ago, I think, in Boston. So it's wonderful to see you and hear you. You know, I think that this question of supply chain, as that we talked about earlier also, is pretty pivotal, because the way the economy works, and fair trade's trying to overcome this, is that from a legal point of view, companies generally are not responsible for their upstream suppliers. And this is why we have post office box corporations completely irresponsible, doing grave damage around the world, whether it's expropriating land of indigenous groups, or environmental degradation, or tax evasion, or other ills. And then you go back and you find you don't even know who the beneficial owner is that has been the intermediary in this. Or companies say, it's not my problem, I just buy those products on international markets and so forth. So this supply chain issue is built in to the system right now. I think at a minimum, all major companies need to report and know how to report on their supply chains. And they generally don't know how to do that. You know, they don't know, well, I just buy so-and-so. And they don't know whether the coffee that they're buying or any other product that they're buying does or doesn't have child labor in it, does or does not get implicated in land use destruction and so forth. So I would ask fair trade, help us, you're experts on this. How do we do certification? How do we impose, and I mean impose, reporting standards everywhere, and not just reporting standards that are kind of cherry picking, where companies say, I like the SDGs, I'm good on SDG 8 or 6 or whatever, but actually reporting on their, and by the way, another point about reporting is that you take a big company, it may have 50 product lines and 80 source countries, and it doesn't in any systematic way either know or report on its supply chains in a systematic way on this. So all of this is to say, I can't give you a glib answer on this, but I think it's crucial, because we know upstream, whether it's child labor, whether it's deforestation, whether it's loss of species abundance, this stuff is real. We know broadly products that are implicated in this, whether it's soybeans or cattle or other things, but we don't trace from that through the supply chain systematically, but we have the means to do so now, whether it's blockchain and barcoding, whether it's other technical solutions. And we also have, which I would really like us to use, which we don't actually, we have satellite measurements twice a day for every part of the world. So we can see every single day land clearing in the Amazon. We can see every single day what's happening in Sabah and Sarawak. We can know these things. Even if, yes, a local corrupt politician's taking a bribe by some fly-by-night company that is smuggling the merchandise, we can see it at least. And if not day by day, we can see it week by week, depending on the pixels and the resolution and so forth. But let's be serious about using these data systematically. You know, another example, I was on a panel with an Indonesian minister responsible for fisheries. And of course, the whole Indonesian archipelago is fished with illegal and undocumented vessels. But you can see them, every one of them, by the satellites, and you can insist on transponders on them and so forth. And we could actually get this under control from a technical point of view. So I think we should be thinking about what are the technical requirements, and then how do we implement these technical requirements in a smart way. And the best companies should be saying, here's what we could do so that we could lean on the not so good companies. And by the way, of course, we need to get China much more engaged in this, because it's a lot of Chinese companies that are bad behaviors, not only, and I'm not pointing a finger exclusively, but I know that it's really the case all over the world where I work, partly because there aren't the same disclosures and regulations and awareness and attention. But this is a big part of why we need cooperation on this also, because I don't think that the Chinese leadership wants an irresponsible, on the ground Chinese company behavior, but we need systems in order to implement proper solutions for this. So help me understand better how to do it, and I will help us brainstorm how to get it into implementation.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And of course, the Global Compact Network has worked closely with companies on their supply chain. More recently in Australia, the reporting around modern slavery and the legislative requirements there, I think, will drive change. And the other very important player are investors, superannuation funds, pension funds. And in Australia, I know a number of the major industry super funds are now requiring their companies that they invest in to be much more transparent about their supply chain and the impact that that has. And I think this could have as big an impact as just about anything. We've got another question, this time from India, from Abhishek Jani, who's the CEO of Fairtrade India. Abhishek.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing this wonderful panel. And Professor Sachs, it's been a really thought-provoking discussion so far. And thank you so much for that. My question is focusing more on the vulnerable communities, particularly the farming communities in Asia, countries like India, where tragically, and this is one of the tragedies of our time, be it climate change, be it COVID, people who suffer the most and face the brunt of these calamities are the people who contribute the least to it. And, there is a huge amount of disruption that we're seeing happening to global trade as a result of COVID. And, that is really pushing the vulnerable farming communities further into poverty as a result. So my question is, what policy or private initiatives could be undertaken to bolster these communities in what I see from your discussions, something that could go on for the next couple of years at least? It would be really helpful.
Great. Well, one thing, Abhishek, is helping these areas, these communities, and especially rural areas, to control the pandemic itself. Because some of the big cities, say in India, are suppressing the epidemic after an outbreak, but it's spreading. Migrant workers have carried it around the country. And, you really fear that the level of local control is not there. And especially in these areas, there isn't protective gear, there aren't face masks, there's not public awareness, there's not connectivity. And so we're going to have, as part of the Lancet COVID Commission, an India task force that is specifically going to include people from all over this vast country to give much better knowledge of real-time local community pressures, events, and so on, because I don't think we have that right now. India's, it's so vast, and so much can happen without one knowing it, except if it's happening in Mumbai or Delhi or Chennai and so on. So this is one thing, is just basic knowledge and being able to respond. A second is, India so chronically is underinvested in public health since independence. It's one of the big mysteries of my life, why that is, because a country should be spending more than 1% of GDP on health, and India just drastically underinvested for so long, and basically has moved to a part private system that caters to upper classes. And this is a big problem right now. So I'm a huge fan of community-based public health, like the ASHA workers, but the ASHA workers have recently gone on strike because they don't even have basic protective equipment right now. And so I'd like to help them stay safe, help to empower them with geophones or with other good digital technologies, and help them to play a leading role in the health in the communities. All of this is part of the answer about the supply chains, because if the communities remain healthy, then the supply chains can be protected, and then the farmers can continue to have their markets. And we need to really understand how to normalize the situation so that these are already people, like you say, that are living at the edge of subsistence, and they can't go on without markets or with lockdowns and so forth. So we need to get the public health scaled up dramatically. India is filled with so many smart people and IT leaders. And you take, again, a case like Jio, which was able to bring 400 million subscribers on in no time, or Aadhaar, and to get people online. We need creative, scaled solutions that reach right into the countryside right now, urgently.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. Thanks for that question, Abhishek. And thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we are out of time. In fact, we've gone over time, and it's partly because there are just so many questions that people have, and because Jeff's talk has been just so inspiring. There are other questions that I'll keep on record, and we'll send them to Jeff. We've got questions from Rocky Tuan, who I'm sure you know from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, from John Hewson, the former leader of the opposition in Australia and a real champion for sustainability and climate action, who does ask whether a Biden victory will be a catalyst for the world to take climate and other challenges seriously. And I think if we
yes, it will be.
So there's a quick answer to that one. Peter Newman, who I think, of course, you know, from Western Australia, a leader in cities, and a number of others. We will be having another event with SDSN later in the year. So hopefully we can give some of those people an opportunity to ask their questions. Jeff, thank you so much for your generosity. Thank you for your inspiration. And thank you, everyone, for being part of this. Thank you.
Great. Bye-bye to everybody. Thank you, John, and to all of the hosts.
Thank you.
Most grateful. Thanks.
Bye.